Hello everyone, I'm Kevin Lane. It's time for Uncle Jonesy's Camera of the Week. And today we're going back to Minolta and we are looking at truly one of my favorite cameras of all time, the Minolta X-700. Now this camera has a place that's very special in my heart and I'll tell you why. My first camera came in 1980, my first real camera. I bought new from a camera store in Atlanta in 1980, and that was the Minolta Xg1. It was a good camera. It was really for a beginner like me. Had only one real setting on it, and that was Aperture Priority. You could go into manual, but the meter didn't work at all, so you mostly used it in Aperture Priority. It was a good camera. Well, while I had that camera, in fact, just a year after that, Minolta released the X-700. Now, I used to hang out in camera stores a lot back in those days, and I even collected the brochures. And I remember picking up the brochure for this camera and thinking, wow, what a cool looking camera. The first thing you notice about this camera when you look at it, first of all, it's black, right? That's a professional camera, isn't it? And you know that black is going to result in some better pictures, right? Yeah, I know. Well, anyway, the other thing I noticed right off the bat is that grip. Do you see the grip? I thought, man, that probably feels really good. And so the first chance I had to hold one of these in a camera store, I picked it up and thought, that fits my hand perfectly. So then I noticed that on the back, it also has a place for your thumb right there, as if somebody sculpted it exactly for my hand. So when I hold this camera with one hand, my finger comes right up here on the shutter button and my thumb goes right behind the film advance. This is probably the most one-handed camera that I have in my collection, that I could just use it in one hand, turning the dial. Of course, you got to have another hand for the lens aperture, but still, just shooting and advancing, it's a really good one-handed camera for that purpose. So there's a lot to like about this camera, but first a little bit of history. It came out in 1981, the year after I bought my Xg1. And they continued to make this camera for all the way up to 1999. And for a few years after that, actually, for quite a few years after that, you could still get a new one in box from the camera stores because they made lots of them. And they wanted to sell this camera to a very wide range of photographers, from beginners in photography all the way to advanced amateurs. Why, they even really wanted it to be a camera for pros. And I'll tell you how we know all this, because when it comes to the pro part of the camera, they made a lot of accessories to go along with this camera. It was truly a system camera. It was meant to be used with a wide range of lenses, flashes, motor drives, a lot of different things I remember in that catalog, just a whole table full of accessories for it. But it was also intended for the beginning photographer because it had something that no other Minolta camera had at the time, and that is it had a program exposure mode. Now, I'm sure you know program means that you basically turn the camera into a point and shoot. It sets the aperture and the exposure for you based on the meter reading. Here on the top dial, the shutter dial, if you turn it to the P setting, you basically got an SLR camera that becomes a point and shoot. You just focus and shoot, and the camera will get good exposures for you. So if you were a beginning photographer and you didn't want to mess with learning or figuring out the aperture, the exposure triangle, you just let the camera do that for you. But if you wanted to go a little bit more advanced and you wanted to take more control over your exposure, you could go to the aperture, the A, and it becomes an aperture priority camera where you set the aperture and it sets the shutter speed. And then if you wanted complete creative control over it, you could then move the shutter dial to one of the settings, one of the shutter settings there, set your aperture, and now you're in complete manual mode. All right, so, and it would meter in manual mode as well, but there's a catch, which we'll get to in a minute. Now, I had some other really cool things. It has a up to +2 or -2 exposure compensation dial, So whatever the camera chose, you could change that just by pushing a button and turning the dial one way or the other. It had a self-timer button here, which you push down for the self-timer, or actually pull up for the self-timer, and it had an automatic exposure lock, right? So you could push it down, and if you were pointing somewhere and then you wanted to change your position, but you wanted to keep the same exposure as it gave you for this side over here, you would push that down. All right, so let's see, it has a film memo holder in the back. Really nice about that. Has depth of field preview right here. All right, I think that, the typical, I will say that of all the cameras I have in my collection, especially SLRs, the view in the viewfinder in this camera is one of the brightest, if not the brightest. It is a very bright viewfinder. And inside the viewfinder, you are able to see your aperture setting, and it has the shutter speeds on the right side of the viewfinder and LED lights. They actually appear as LED lights. And so when you're in Aperture Priority, it will show you what shutter speed it selects by the lighting up of LED lights on there. And the shutter range goes from, it's not a huge range, it goes from a bulb, of course, and 1 second all the way up to 1,000. And that's where you start to see where Minolta made this camera, wanting it to be a pro camera, but not willing to make it completely a pro camera, because obviously they wanted it to cover a very wide range of experience. And so there are things that pro cameras would have that this camera doesn't have. And right off the bat, that only 1/1000th of a speed shutter. That's definitely one. Another thing that people point to about this camera, well, is that it is a plastic camera. Now, you may think, and people will say, that it is largely a plastic camera, and that's true. But when you pick this up, you really don't get the feel of plastic. You get a feel of a very solid, durable camera. Now, I don't know just how durable it is. I don't beat my cameras up. I'm not a professional. I don't go out and wear them out like you would, true pro cameras. But I think that this camera would do pretty well. It doesn't feel cheaply made at all. It feels solid. And as I said at the beginning, the feel of it in your hand, I just think it's got the best one I've ever held. Now, another limitation about the camera is that, and this is something I don't understand why Minolta did it, but I told you earlier that it meters in manual, and it does. It shows the suggested shutter speed in the viewfinder, and of course you can see the aperture. What it does not show you is the shutter speed you've selected. So when you're looking through and you see that it suggests something, you have to take your eye out of the viewfinder and look on the top to see what it is you've selected, unless you kind of get a feel for where you are on the dial, which I think is possible. But it would have been nice if they'd been able to show you both things. And what's interesting is Minolta released a camera a year or two after this, the X-570, which does not have the program exposure, but it does have that manual setting where you see both what you've selected and what the camera suggests too, which means you never have to take your eye out of the viewfinder for that. It would have been nice if they put that in here, but that's just one of the little corners they lopped off to try to make the camera affordable and yet as much for pros as possible. Now, another thing that and I don't really have the experience with it, but I have read, is that the camera has a kind of a quick cutoff when it comes to metering in low light, EV -1. So it's really not great for long exposures. If you want to set an automatic and then do a time exposure and let it choose it, it will probably close the shutter early before it should, because it's just not capable of keeping it open that long. However, in Aperture Priority and Program, the shutter speeds are stepless, so if it wants something in between 1,000th and 1/500th of a second, it will choose that because there is no step. It chooses exactly what the exposure it thinks the exposure ought to be. Another corner that Minolta cut with the camera that, it really doesn't bother me too much, is that it's a cloth shutter instead of a titanium shutter, and it travels horizontally, which is probably why the flash sync speed is a kind of pedestrian 1/60th of a second, whereas pro cameras were starting to increase that quite a bit. But it's, like I said, it's meant to appeal to the masses, and it certainly was marketed that way, and that's why there are many of them out there, because it did sell a lot. Won some awards, and I think it's a really great sleeper of a camera. Now, this was the last manual focus camera, that manual focus SLR that Minolta made, because it was shortly after this that they developed their autofocus cameras, the Maxim series, starting with the 7000 and the 9000, and in some ways the 9000 is based on this camera. But I love this camera, and I got one of these in in the mid-90s, I think, because my Xg1 had stopped working and our kids had come along, and I wanted to have something to document the family. And so this was the second camera I ever bought new in the box, the Xg1 and the X-700, and I got the Minolta X-700 from a camera store in New York. So, and actually sometime after that, I kind of got jealous of Kelly and his Nikon cameras, and so I ended up selling my Minoltas and getting a couple of Nikon bodies. And then a couple of years ago, Kelly called me up one day and said, "Hey, I've got something for you. I've got this X700, and I only paid $10 for it with the lens." And I said, "Great." And when I picked it up again, it was like, wow. I remember so much why I like this camera. The MPS stands for Minolta Program System, by the way. It's that program that goes in there. Now, when I had those brochures, I would look at this camera and I'd look at the accessories, and the flashes for this camera are really cool because they have that PX in them, like the 280 PX. And all of those cameras all those flashes were developed specifically for this camera, and they speak directly with the camera in a dedicated way. When you're using those flashes, you actually get a flash metering off the film plane, which is really cool. The camera, you don't have to think anything about. You just choose your aperture, and the camera adjusts the flash for that setting. It will put it automatically in the 1/60th of a second, and you'll see that blinking light inside on the LED. So if you're going to use this with a flash, you really want to use one of the Minolta PX flashes with it, because it really is nice to have that flash metering. The other accessory that I saw in the catalog was I thought, whoa, that has to be the coolest thing ever. But I never got one back in those days, but later on I did, and that is the MD1 motor drive. Because when you put this motor drive on the camera like this, and I'm going to try to do this quickly, it's kind of a slightly three-handed thing. May have to edit some video here. There's a little wheel you turn. Looks like I'm going to get it the first time. When you get that on the camera, first of all, you get this grip right here. And if the grip on just the camera was good, the grip on this motor drive is superb. It just has a great feel. You can just carry this thing. I just wrap the strap. Typically with cameras like this, I wrap the strap a couple of times around my wrist, and then I just go shooting like this. I don't put it on my neck or anything like that. Now, it will add some weight because the camera is actually being powered by the batteries in the motor drive, and that's a good thing because it'll keep it going long after the batteries in the camera die, if they happen to die on you. And you can go all the way up to to 3.5 frames a second on the motor drive on this. And I should point out that the shutter button on these cameras, this is something else that's really cool. It's the same kind of shutter button that was on the Xg1s, where it's actually electronic touch sensitive switch, where when you put your finger on it, all you have to do is touch it. It activates the meter stays on for a few seconds, and then it'll go off, and that saves the battery power in it. So all you gotta do is touch that. And then on the motor drive, they actually put 2 of those on here. They put one here, because that's where your grip is going to be. You don't have to reach back to the camera shutter. You can just do it right here. And then they actually have another one here. So if you're in vertical position, you've got a shutter right here. See it? That's cool. I mean, I really like that. It's funny because when I got the motor drive, someone said, "Oh, you'll never use that." And the truth is, I keep it on the camera all the time. And I don't mind it being heavier. And it has a great sound. I'll fire off. I got film in the camera, but that's all right. I'll fire off a frame here. Ready? Look, check this out. That's great. So it certainly has a few limitations in it, and I will tell you that there is an issue as the cameras age. The shutter is all electronic. You cannot use it without batteries. And by the way, the batteries are S76 batteries. They're silver oxide, 1.5 volt. They're available just about everywhere. Little button batteries. It takes 2 of those. But there's a capacitor in the electronics that fails as it ages, and it's possible that you may get one and it may become a brick. But apparently, it's not hard to replace if you're willing to do that. And then once you replace it, you probably will never have to do it again, because the problem is with the capacitor and not with the camera. This one runs fine, and it is as clean as can be. So I'm just going to keep using it. In fact, I've been asked if I could only have 1 or 2 cameras, and I had to get rid of all the others, I would just keep Uncle Jonesy's SRT 202, of course, and I'd keep this one. These are the 2 cameras that I would keep. All right, so prices on this camera. Well, Kelly got this one for $10, and he got lucky. They've gone up a bit since then. I did a little check, and you're going to pay somewhere between $100 and $150 for a camera with the 1.7 lens, which is the 3 lenses. The 1.7, the 1.4, and the 1.2 are the 50 millimeters. The 1.7, by the way, which I have 2 of those, very good lens. The 1.4, it's a stellar lens. Don't have one of those, but anyway. So the Minolta X-700. It's a great camera, and if you've got one, then this could end up being your favorite camera as well. Hope you enjoyed that. If you like our show, you might like our podcast. Be sure to check it out on your favorite podcast sources. The Uncle Jonesy's Cameras podcast. Kelly and I get on there and talk about film photography. If you like that, or you want to do some reading, we've got a blog. It's unclejonesyscameras.blogspot.com, and Jonesy's is spelled Jonesys. We leave out the apostrophe. We have a Facebook page and an Instagram account, UJC Podcast. We'd love to hear from you too if you want to email us at unclejonesyscameras@gmail.com. All right, that's our camera of the week. I'll be back next week with another one. Until then, get out there and capture those spring moments in your life and in your family. And happy shooting, everybody.